start record and we'll share my screen. All right. And put it in slideshow mode. Hey, technology's on my side today. All right. So, again, some of this is obvious, but I find that a lot of writers think they're done when their story is done, when they've got all the story pieces together and the character, and they don't always remember to go back through and do that pass or those several passes for that sentence level stuff. And really, when I was working on my book on tension, how to write a page turner, there's so much potential for creating tension within the sentence level and for creating, energy and of course a beautiful flow. And we've seen this in each other's writing. We all have, I think there's a lot of gift in this group for just incredible sentence work. And we all have room to improve as well. So just a reminder that at some point before you think you're done, I actually do recommend you do the read your book aloud to yourself or to this is what I've heard is really good, but this takes commitment. Read it aloud to a recording device and then listen to it back. That's two phases, but at the very least, reading it aloud, you hear things that you might not otherwise hear, right? Or see. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about verbs. And again, like I said, I hope you don't feel like you're back in English class, but verbs are very important because they're the muscle and the energy of your sentences, right? They're that action word. And so there's lots and lots of verbs you can choose from. There's a kind of common way of referring to verbs as either being strong or weak, right? And so strong verbs, you'll know them when you see them. Weak verbs, so like, here's just some basic verbs: bounce, kick, sing, run, tell, see. And then there are some weak verbs, particularly anything that is a conjugation of the verb to be. So were, was, are, is, tend to be kind of weak feeling, and there's usually a stronger way to put them. But I like to go over verb tenses really quickly, just because despite everything, I find a lot of us struggle with this, whether we're writing in the past tense or the present tense. And sometimes we'll go in and out. So just a quick refresher here that you really have to stay in the same tense that you start out in, unless you're doing something kind of creative, like you're dropping back in time in a flashback and you've clearly switched the tense for that reason, or somebody can talk in a different tense. But when the narrative and the exposition characters need to be in the same tense, so past tense, right? He walked, I heard, they saw. Present tense, he walks, I hear, they see. Incorrect, he saw a deer in the road as he drives by. The reader's going to go, whoops, something's wrong here. But a lot of us, I think sometimes it has to do with present tense is so very immediate that sometimes if we're writing something that is intense, or we're in the moment with our characters, we might drop and switch to the present tense without meaning to. Another thing to think about is that present tense, which I think we might have talked about, has a real, again, that word has a real immediate quality to it. And so depending on the kind of content you're writing, you might want to consider whether you want to be writing in the present tense when the past tense it doesn't make everything feel far away or distant. It just kind of gives a little beat, a little room between the reader and the content. So I wanted to give some examples. I guess these slides could be better ordered. Strong verbs. I love the verbs that this author, Warren Ellis, chooses in this passage from this crazy little book called Crooked Little Vein. I rifled the jacket for cigarettes, harvested one, and went back to my chair. I swabbed some of the nicotine scum off the window. I just love that. Like, I was thinking he could have written, I put my hand in the jacket looking for cigarettes. I found one. I wiped, but there's something about rifled and harvested and swabbed that, to me, those are strong verbs. They're interesting verbs. They make for interesting sentences. Again, back to this idea of the verb to be. So these verbs, whenever you see was in particular, it was a dark day. There was a man on the porch. Those are all, most of the time you can actually get rid of there was and cut straight to, a man stood on the porch sort of thing. But go through your manuscript at some point and do a pass for these verbs and see where they can be eliminated or changed. They also are often shortcuts, right? So he was mad. Okay, so, we've talked about this in past lessons. Demonstrate that. Don't just tell us he was mad. Show us what mad looks like in action or other dialogue or something like that. Use imagery. Sorry, my screen isn't there. So another thing I like to remind people is that language is very much an auditory medium first. You know, we spoke, we sung before we, I believe, before we started writing. And language has energy and flow and music. You know, I'm not saying that it has to sound floral and fancy, but it has a music of its own. That means that when we read with our inner ear, so when we read with our eyes, but we hear it in our minds, we kind of hear the flow, right? And so it's good to think about, to become aware of that flow of your writing, and notice whether or not you've got, you know, sentences that are all the same length, words that repeat in an unhelpful way. Can you bring some things in to make them, the flow, the musicality more obvious? Some alliteration, some repetition of words and images, which I'll show you some examples of. Some juxtaposition. That's one of those fancy English class words, right? Couple of examples of alliteration. Now, I don't know about you, but we got taught this poet when I was in high school, Gerard Manley Hopkins. Anyone get forced to read Gerard Manley Hopkins? And he was like the kind of alliteration that every sentence had, you know, it was like all full of the same syllables. It was really funny. So you don't have to go Gerard Manley Hopkins style, which is like crazy alliteration, but notice in this example from I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, where you hear it. So up the aisle, the moans and screams merged with a sickening smell of woolen black clothes, worn in summer weather, and green leaves wilting over yellow flowers. It has a music, you know, the moans and screams merged. There's M's and S's in there, right? The sickening smell of woolen. And then I like that, green leaves wilting over yellow flowers. There's a lot of W's in there. Whether or not it's intentional, I like to believe it is, because she's such a master writer. It makes a sentence, to me, it gives it texture, it makes it interesting, and often you can use alliteration, particularly if you're trying to create an ambiance or a tone or a sound. You can actually use the sound of the letters. There's an example I often use from Winter's Bone, where he describes, she's walking on ice, like the ice was, let me think if I can, like something about axe cracks, right? He's describing the sound of walking on ice as the sound of axe cracks, axe wax or something. And I loved how it sounds like what it is doing. You know, it's cracking, it's whacking. Here's a way you can use repetition as in a conscious choice of repetition. This is from a short story. Even if you never read any James Joyce or have no wish to, this one short story is actually quite good. I love this repetition. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end. There's something about that snow falling faintly and faintly falling that really zooms you into the moment. And to me, it actually kind of recreates the sound, like you really become aware of what snow, quote unquote, sounds like, right? It doesn't have a sound, and yet it's a sound by absence of sound. So playing with repetition when it drives home a kind of stylistic purpose is fun to do. And then juxtaposition. This is, of course, a technique in where two or more ideas, images, places, characters are placed side by side, and that's the very friction of those two, the difference between those two things creates a kind of energy or tension. Whether that's like a alliterative one with the sounds, or here he's comparing things, you'll see. So April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow. So there's this like life and death being paired. I love that winter kept us warm, even though you think of winter as being cold, right? So there's all this like, I guess you could say kind of a reversal of expectation, which makes you kind of go, oh, that's interesting. So now you're not writing poetry necessarily, although frankly, David, I'd argue you kind of are. You might have a good use of juxtaposition. Oh, I did have it here. Oh, good. This one could technically fall into the alliterative area, but I like, again, going back to idea of sentences having a music. I love this quote. So the world seemed huddled and hushed, and her crunching steps cracked loud as axe wax. So there, what he's doing is he's actually using the sounds of the words to recreate the literal sounds that he's describing. Does that make sense? So he's showing you both huddled and hushed creates, by nature of the H's and the SH's, creates a hushing sound, and crunching steps cracked loud as axe wax create a crunching, hard, sharp sound, right? So I know this all sounds like, you know, it might be way more complicated than anything you want to do in your writing, but you might even find you have an intuitive or organic tendency towards some of these things, and you might just notice it in your revision, like, oh, hey, I'm pretty good at that musical sentence thing, you know. Some things to avoid are what I call pronoun ambiguity, and that's where you have multiple versions of a word like he, she, they, where it's no longer clear to the reader who you're talking about, especially if you have two she's in a scene or two he's or whatever, and the reader starts to get confused. I see this all the time in manuscripts, and it's just really simple, either putting a name or reordering the sentence. Here's a version of that. Here's the confusing version. The adults arrived before the kids were ready. Julia was glad she'd had the foresight to feed them before that. Well, who is Julia feeding? I mean, we can probably pick it up from the context, but let's just be clear. She is feeding the children. So in the revised version, Julia was glad she'd had the foresight to feed the kids before the adults arrived. Clarifying, simplifying, making sure the reader is not confused. The reason these kinds of things matter, not only because, you know, sure, you can trust your reader to figure it out, but what you want to do is to create a seamless experience so that the reader is not stopping and jarring over these little details and thinking, wait, who's who, right? We want to try and create this, I think John Gardner called it a dream. You want the reader to fall into the dream of your writing and not have to wake up from it until the book is over. So before I talked about a welcome use of repetition, right? So we had faintly falling and falling faintly. But now you want to look for places where repetition is working against your writing. So using word too much, too often, two similar words within this, like two repeating sentences. This is a really bad example, but just, you know, here's mine. Just the thought of school gave me a stomachache. I didn't want to go to school. Bad things happened to me at school. Okay, so what can we get rid of in this example, right? Several instances of school. Just the thought of school gave me a stomachache. I didn't want to go. Bad things happened to me there. We know he means school. Sometimes the other thing I notice is even when you have like one word and then a word that's similar to it, I'm trying to think like craft and crafting. Let's say you have craft in one sentence and then in the following sentence you have crafting. They're not the same exact word, but they're close enough, and sometimes that repetition will be jarring. So look for those kinds of instances and cut them out. Another thing to look for is redundancy, which is where you say something that has already been said, but perhaps in a different way, or you literally repeat yourself. It could be something subtle, like he was popular with the people. Popular assumes with the people, so you don't need to say it. Or it could be more overt, like he kicked the door of his closet because he was mad. I'm so angry, he shouted. Well, you can probably do one or the other, right? You probably can get rid of the because he was mad. He kicked the door of his closet. Or I'm so angry, he shouted. You know, either one, you get the gist. The goal, of course, is always to be as active as possible and to tell the reader as little as possible. Sorry, this kind of jumps around, but it's all right. I may not finish this whole lecture just in the interest of time. So I'll go through a few more slides. Anyways, interesting word choices. Now, I know we're all sensitive to not sounding like we're using big words and words that are, you know, out of place. But I know that I always appreciate an interesting word when I stumble across it. I love the word choices here from this short story by Lori Moore. At work, you will be lachrymose and distracted. You will shamble through the hall like a legume with feet. People will notice. Even just shamble, like that word, I was like, oh, I forgot about that word. That's a great word, right? There's so many ways you could move through a corridor, but shamble is a very specific kind of movement. I love that. I also often recommend that you think about your particular characters and their like lexicon, how they think, what words they would use if it's in the context of their own thoughts or words, rather than you know, because a lot of times I don't know if this happens to you, but I'll often get told like, well, that your character sounds like you, and it's like, okay, gotta take me out of here and really think about who this character is and how they would talk, think, and what words they would use. In general, kind of learning to cut to the chase instead of using a lot of words is a very helpful tool for us writers, depending on the kind of writer you are. Some of us are more minimalist and spare. A couple of examples here. We spent all of the entire morning caulking the boat for the purpose of making it watertight. This was the first time I had ever done that job in my whole life. A lot of extra words there, right? That's mean the same. Revised, we spent all morning caulking the boat. A new experience for me. So, you know, this kind of thing is often, I find this kind of sentence, cumbersome sentences for myself, I find these in my second or third drafts. You know, I don't notice them in my first drafting process because I can't. I have to just get the story down. But I do notice that I'm long-winded and wordy, so you may be as well. All right, just a couple more slides and then, oh, why is this not moving? There we go. I can't even see the title of my own slide here. Sorry. There we go. Weak filler words. Ah, yes. So in the same vein as kind of cutting to the chase, there's a lot of words. And I should say a lot of these slides I got from a book called Getting the Words Right by Theodore Rees Cheney. But Nancy had a title that she just told me about. Write Stunning Sentences. Was that it? By Nina. I forget the last name already. Nina somebody. You could type it into the chat. So there's a couple books, there's probably multiple books. And they're great because there are all these little things you don't always think about. So this is another one. Because of him, I became aware of the whole there is, there was, there are, as just like words that fill space and don't need to be there. So as an example, there was a man with a scary expression walking up my steps. You can just get rid of there was altogether. A man with a scary expression walked up my steps. Not only that, it takes the verb tense, the walking up, takes it out of the gerund form and puts it into past tense, walked up, which is a little stronger, less passive voice. Same thing, there was a battle taking place, revised. A battle took place, a battle ensued. And of course I wrote, better yet, show the battle in action. Don't just tell us that it happened. So anytime you find there was, there is, you can almost always get rid of it. And then it just forces you to sort of slightly revise the sentence to make it a little stronger. And there's a lot of little filler words like that usually can go. Similarly, other words you can get rid of are what I call perceptual words. So that's when you have you'll write in the sentence, she noticed it was snowing, right? Instead, she heard the sound of the alarm. Instead, like, tell us what that sounded like. The alarm shrilled like a hawk after a mouse. I can't think off the top of my head, but you know what I'm saying? So you cut those perceptual words, noticed, saw, heard, tasted, felt, she felt. You get rid of them and you go straight to the action. And I'll show you an example here. This one is using the sense of smell. So she smelled bacon and eggs. So get rid of smelled can become the house reeked of the meaty sugar of bacon and the pungent tang of eggs. Something like that. What you're doing is you're taking away the focus from, you're like, instead of putting it right on what the character, the sense they're using, you're putting it onto what it is they're actually observing, feeling, sensing, etc. Does that make sense? Another big pet peeve of mine as an editor, having edited a lot of books over the years, is sentence length. And it's something, again, we're not always aware of until we've really drafted our books, but really start to become aware when you read your manuscript over, if you have a tendency toward, you know, lots of short sentences that all are the same length, or lots of really long-winded run-on sentences that force the reader to stop and take a breath in the middle because it's so long, right? And try to sort of reach for a variety of sentence lengths, and I'll give you an example. All right, and this example, I realize I don't have the actual book it comes from, but it is from getting the words right again. So example, he rappelled down the vertical face of the building, his boots beating a rhythm against the bricks. Boots, they'd be the death of him one day, him and his damned boots. So what I love about this is that the first sentence is in itself a kind of gliding. It's long. It moves like how a person rappelling down a building might. I love that quality. And then it hits you with this short one-word sentence, boots, which to me is like kind of like a pause. So we have long sentence, then we have a short sentence. And then the next two sentences are, you know, they're neither short nor long. So there's a flow, there's a variety. And again, you're not gonna be thinking about this consciously as you write, but you will notice this stuff in your revisions when you go back to read your own work to yourself. And other people will notice it for you if you don't notice it for yourself. So readers. Another one, and actually this has the same quality as that last one. It's like long, short, medium sentences. The platoon of frightened young soldiers slithered under the barbed wire fence, rifles balanced across their arms. Krauts! They stopped moving. They stopped moving and breathing. So same thing, long sentence, short sentence, medium sentences, you know, and I really like the way that makes the energy of the sentence, the paragraph flow nicely. So I think I'm going to leave